Perfect. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started with today's presentation. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining today's web event, Juvenile Sex Offenders Navigating Risks of Reoffending and Treatment. My name is William Moore with OJJDP NTTAC, and before we get, and this webinar is brought to you by our colleagues at the National District Attorneys Association, and before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items to keep in mind. Please note that today's web event is being recorded. This webinar, along with other archived webinars, are available on NTTAC's YouTube page. If you'd like to receive the transcript or supporting materials for any of the webinars on our YouTube page, you can feel free to reach out to the OJJDP NTTAC Help Desk at the email address displayed on this slide. If you're having trouble downloading any of the items of the events that are provided a little bit early, you can go ahead and feel free to contact the help desk if you need assistance with downloading that file that we shared. My co-host is going to put a Google Drive link in the chat where you all can click on that link, and it will also have the handout for today's web event that you can easily download. So if you have issues downloading that file that I shared earlier, feel free to click on that Google Drive link, and it will be able to allow for you to get access to that item. For optimal audio, we ask for you to have the system to dial out through your WebEx, from the WebEx system to your phone line. When you're connected, you'll see a phone headset icon that will appear next to your name. Please note that all participants have come in on mute, and only the panelists and presenters will be able to be heard during today's web event. All other participation and communication will be done through the chat that I'll discuss earlier. If you're experiencing any if you're experiencing any technical difficulties during the web event, please be sure to send me, the host, a private chat. Now, in regards to the chat box, please note that we will utilize the chat in order for you to submit any questions that are related to the content. Simply go to the chat window, type your question related to the content there, and in the send to box, make sure that you are sending to everyone or all panelists. Again, be sure to send your question related to the content today to either everyone or all panelists, and that will we'll be able to receive your question that are coming in during the live web event. Be sure to also hit enter or send to send your question. Now, help us count. If you're viewing by yourself, there's no need to do anything at this time. But if you're viewing with additional people, we're asking for you all to help us count. Go to the chat window and send to all panelists or everyone the total number of additional people in the room with you today, not including yourself. So if it's yourself or your fellow prosecutor that's joining for today, you would put +1 in the chat so that we can indicate how many individuals that we have for today. Again, if you're viewing alone or by yourself, no need to type anything at this time, and please send to either everyone or all panelists. At the end of today's webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance within 24 hours via an automated email. Please keep an eye out for your certificate in your email. This is the agenda for today's webinar. And now I will turn today's presentation over to our host and moderator, Ms. Rachel Larson with the National District Attorneys Association. Rachel, I am passing the virtual ball to you, and you can take it away.
Thank you, William. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Larson, and I'm with the National District Attorney Association. Before I started with them, I was a juvenile court resource prosecutor and sexual abuse resource prosecutor for the state of North Carolina. I'm thrilled to be able to give these trainings to prosecutors and others across the country. I would like you to know that if you're a prosecutor, I can arrange to give a presentation like this one or other ones that I've already given in your state with credit in your state for prosecutors there. Right now, this course is approved in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. So if you're licensed there, you can automatically apply for and receive CLE credits. Because we're approved in 3 states, if you would like to try to apply to your bar, we can give you that information. I'll drop it in the chat, the email that you should send a request for information from, and hopefully your bar will be kind to you and give you credit for this course. All right, so I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Peter Coons has his doctorate in psychology, and he is the Director of Clinical Services and Programs for the North Carolina Division of Juvenile Justice. He has spent the majority of his career in the field with juvenile offenders who are in youth development centers. So he has both theoretical and practical knowledge about juvenile sex offenders. He was a tremendous help to me when I was a juvenile court resource prosecutor in North Carolina. He gave his cell phone number out to prosecutors so they could call and consult about their cases with him. He wrote articles for prosecutors on the risk of juvenile reoffending and was generally all around very helpful. But before we start with Peter, I want to go through a few things. One is a disclaimer that nothing that either I or Peter say is necessarily the view of OJJDP. It's our own views. Required to say that. And for those of you who just joined, this is Juvenile Sex Offenders Navigating the Risk of Reoffending and Treatment. Now, I'd like to cover just a few things for the prosecutors here with us today about how very difficult it is to handle juvenile sex offense cases. It's difficult because, generally speaking, there aren't any eyewitnesses. Offenders usually offend in private bedrooms at night when everyone is asleep. So there isn't going to be a witness to corroborate your victim, which makes it a difficult case. All these things make the cases very difficult to handle, but I'm going to also go into why it's so important that they're handled and they're handled well. When we have no eyewitnesses, that's hard. Also, more often than not, it's very common there's a delayed disclosure, and that's because the victim knows the offender, and delayed disclosures are the norm in sexual abuse. When we have delayed disclosures, we also don't usually have physical evidence. There's this mythology out there of the broken or torn hymen, that at any point in a woman's life or a child's life, if they're penetrated, that they'll have evidence via this torn hymen. This is just not correct, but it's a mythology that exists with juries and with the judges that you present in front of. They have studies that show that women can give birth to babies and they go back for gynecological exams, and the doctor wouldn't have known that they'd given birth to babies, nevertheless had sex or not had sex. So there's a lot of myths around what physical evidence there should be, and then there's delayed disclosures, so you don't get semen, you don't get DNA. So physical evidence is difficult. And then, of course, in order to explain all of this to your judge, you're going to need subject matter experts. You'll need to have forensic interviewers, sane nurses, doctors who work with you to help explain all of these myths and the lack of eyewitnesses, the delayed disclosures, the lack of physical evidence. And you'll need to work with these experts on the law, which is very difficult law around child sexual abuse, because you need to explain to the judge what the characteristics of sexually abused children are, at the same time not vouching for the credibility of the victim. And that's a very fine line. So you need to have studied the law and put a good team together of experts. Then you're going to have young victims, and their problems. The difficulties really of dealing with young victims are that they may not remember what happened to them by the time you get them to trial, and then you'll have evidentiary issues trying to get in prior statements. In addition, young victims are not like little adults, and they're difficult to talk to. Juvenile court prosecutors who handle sexual abuse cases should take a course specifically on how to speak to child victims, because there are things you can do with your language to make it easier for them to understand you, and also more likely that they'll respond with a full response that helps the case. Finally, the last thing that makes these cases really difficult is prosecutor inexperience. If you're a juvenile court prosecutor listening today, chances are that you're a new junior juvenile court prosecutor. It's not that way in all parts of the country, but it is that way in most parts of the country, that juvenile court is looked at as a training ground where new prosecutors come to really get their sea legs before they move up into superior court. So all those things make it very difficult to handle these child sexual abuse cases, and yet they couldn't be more important. They're some of the most important caseload that you'll carry in juvenile court. And the reason is because you, as the prosecutor in that courtroom, have the ability to simply change the world. There's a study that was done in 2010 that shows that for juvenile sex offenders who received treatment for sex offending, after 10 years, only 5% of them reoffended. The rate for those who weren't given treatment was 18%. So that is a 72% difference in reoffending, just based on whether or not a juvenile received treatment. And then that trend follows through the years. 20 years later, they looked at it, and the group that had received treatment had a 9% reoffending rate, and the group that hadn't received treatment had a 21% reoffending rate. So you can, again, reduce over 20 years reduce reoffending by over 50% by insisting that a juvenile who's adjudicated responsible for a sex offense receives treatment in the courtroom you work in. And I want to go back and add that these numbers are impressive on their own, but they're more impressive when you consider the fact that 36% of all sex offenses committed against children are committed by juvenile offenders. So if you're a prosecutor who's working alone in your juvenile court and these sex offenses are overwhelming you, and you wonder what is going on, there are just a lot of sex offenses. 36% of sex offenses committed against children are committed by juveniles on average. So then we discuss or get to the slide discussing what happens to the victims of child sex abuse. Well, the effects are profound. I know many of you will have heard of the ACEs study, but I just want to go into it for a second. There was this really enterprising researcher named Felitti, who was looking at a weight loss clinic and noticed that the 286 people who had dropped out of the study had all lost weight. So he was curious as to why they were dropping out, and he went and asked them a bunch of questions. And one of the questions he asked was about whether or not they had been sexually abused. It turns out that over 50%, well over 50%, the majority of the participants who dropped out, even though they were losing weight, had been sexually abused. So that sparked a bulb for him in his head that he should study this more, that there is a correlation between poor health outcomes and child sexual abuse. He was able to recruit in a huge, massive study, 17,000 volunteers, and ask them about childhood traumas that they had experienced. These volunteers were on whole pretty well off. They had jobs, they had attended college, they had insurance, so they had jobs that were good enough to carry insurance. And yet the results that he got back were pretty startling. There was a question that he asked, let me see, I wrote it down. Basically saying, here it is. Did an adult person, he asked this question of all these 17,000 participants. Did an adult person at least 5 years or older ever touch your body in a sexual way? And did an adult person at least 5 years or older ever attempt oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? 28% of this crowd that was, very well off and well functioning had 28% of women had answered yes to that question, and 16% of men answered yes. So not only is there a large amount of juveniles committing sex offenses, there's overall the proportion of society that has experienced a sex offense in childhood is very, very high. And the reality is that child abuse is one of the gravest and most costly public health issues that we have in the United States today. If we were able to eradicate child abuse, including child sexual abuse, then we would be able to reduce the rate of depression by 1/2. We would be able to reduce alcoholism by 2/3 and suicide by 2/3 and IV drug use by 3/4. So that's pretty profound. That's what I mean when, if you can handle these cases in juvenile court and handle them well and get treatment to offenders, then there's a cycle that can be stopped, and that can result in amazing things for the people who would have been victims. All right. It looks like here we go. Here we are. So in addition, I want to say that not only are you preventing future victims, but when you work with the current victims that you have, you are making a difference in their life. We know that there are protective factors for victims that help them to get through the child abuse in their past. And those protective factors include emotional competence, control beliefs, active coping, optimism, social attachment, external attribution of blame, and most importantly, support from the family and the wider social environment. As a prosecutor, when you come in and spend time with the victim and their family and help them through the court process and advocate for them in the courtroom, then they can see their views about control of the situation can change. Certainly, they can develop an external attribution of blame rather than an internal attribution of blame. And most importantly, they feel support from a wider social environment, from the juvenile justice system. Finally, this is the last thing I'm going to talk to you about because I really want to turn it over to Dr. Coons. One thing they don't train you about in law school, among the many, many things that they don't train you about in law school, is how do you know whether something is sexual exploration that's normal versus abuse. There could be a whole course on that. So I just want to, for new prosecutors out there who are getting their first few cases, give you a few things to look at. You should look at whether there's a big age difference, whether there's coercion involved in what happens, or lack of consent. If there's an inequality dynamic between the two children or the juvenile and the child, and certainly the degree of force that is used in what transgresses. So these things are things you can look at in your case, and to make sure that what you're seeing is not it's criminal behavior that needs to be treated criminally versus behavior that is normal and can be handled through different channels. All right, so that's where I end, and Dr. Coons takes over. Thank you, Dr. Coons.
All right, thank you, Ms. Larson, and thank you for everyone for joining us today for this really important discussion. That this is a population which is very near and dear to my heart. So I have a little bit of history. I can take you back to 1999. 1999, I was applying to graduate schools, and in one of them, a professor asked me a question as a interest interview. He said, what people group do you feel as a psychologist that you could never work with, that you would never have any kind of clinical interest, or you could never have any clinical rapport with? So I thought about it at the time, and I said to him, I feel that I could never have any clinical rapport with individuals, particularly men, who commit sexual offenses. That I feel that this population is so reprehensible that I can never have any clinical empathy with this population whatsoever. So you fast forward 5 years. I have my very first job as a staff psychologist at a place called C.A. Dillon Youth Development Center. C.A. Dillon was located in Butner, North Carolina. It was part of the juvenile justice system. And I knew that it was part of the juvenile justice system. What I didn't realize at the time that I started working there was that C.A. Dillon Youth Development Center was also the main hub for the North Carolina juvenile justice system for all juveniles who had committed a sexual offense or engaged in sexual abusive behavior. So I ended up spending the next 7 years of my career, the first 7 years of my career, working almost exclusively with juveniles who had engaged in this type of behavior. I then actually spent, I went over to the adult side, to a adult prison, where I worked at a place called Central Prison in North Carolina. It's our maximum security prison. And again, I had a caseload of about 60 men there. And the majority of the men that I work with had committed some kind of sexually abusive behavior. And then I came back to the juvenile justice system in 2017. And again, I started working with juveniles who had committed sexual abusive behavior. I went to court. I did group sessions. I've done individual sessions. I would say of one group that I've spent the most time with on a professional basis, it is juveniles who have committed sexual abusive behavior. And I think back to that comment back in 1999 when I was asked that question. What I was really responding to the professor was I was thinking, what's the people group that everybody kind of doesn't like? That is kind of this stigma about this. I had never met a individual that had committed a sexual abusive behavior. But at the time, I thought this is probably one of the most hated groups out there. So this is pretty safe. I can say that I have a great deal of interest, a great deal of empathy, a great deal of clinical rapport with this population. So it's important to examine our stigmas. I think that's the very first thing that I would tell everybody on this call is that we have that media and the internet and TV really kind of fuels us with a bunch of stereotypes about this population, whether it's adult sexual offenders or juveniles who engage in sexually abusive behavior. We have a bunch of stereotypes in our heads that hopefully we can talk about some of those stereotypes today. So when Rachel presented this this option for this webinar, I thought, well, what can I tell prosecutors? What if I had if I have an hour with prosecutors or people that are involved in the court process, what would I want them to know? And there's really three topics that I felt there are three main areas that I feel are going to be really important. Number one is what are the best practices for risk assessment and prediction for future offending? This is the question that any therapist that has worked with this population is asked more than any other question, is how can I make sure, how can I predict that this individual is not going to go out to society and reoffend? And how can I make sure that the public safety criteria is met? And that is an excellent question. That is something that obviously makes sense. It makes sense that court wants to know that. It makes sense as a prosecutor that you would want to know that. There are some tricky things to that with juveniles, and we're going to talk about that. Number two is, as Ms. Larson has stated, treatment works, and we have a lot of empirical evidence that support that Ms. Larson actually talked about one of the studies that I'm going to mention about the 10 and 20 year follow-up that really shows about recidivism rates after treatment. And then number three, that I'm going to talk about a few other important factors that are associated with a reduction in recidivism for this population. So where do you start with this group? Well, it's important that this conversation is important on a global health scale. Is that adolescents account for more than 1/3 of all known sexual assaults against minors, and 17 to 20% of all sexual crimes, except for prostitution. The peak age at which juveniles sexually offend against children under the age of 12 is when the juvenile themselves is 13 or 14 years old. Youth who engage in sexual abusive behavior are predominantly male. And other than the fact that they are predominantly male, this is an incredibly diverse group. That these adolescents may have little in common with each other aside from their administrative classification under law and policy. And this is a real important point to start on, is that this is an incredibly diverse population. It would be wonderful if I could tell you this is the profile of a typical juvenile who commits and engages in this particular behavior and in sexually abusive behavior. But aside from the fact that they're predominantly men and male, that there is very little commonality that goes across the spectrum. And they come from all races, all socioeconomic statuses, all education statuses, that individuals with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, that people that come from very stable home environments, and people that come from abusive and neglectful environments, that we see that individuals who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior have come from all of these different backgrounds. That ages are really a diversity. And so that makes it incredibly difficult to have a standardized treatment or a standardized assessment that we do for every single youth. It has to be very individualized. The other point that I want to make, if there's one thing that everyone leaves here with this presentation, is that juveniles who engage in sexual sexual abusive behavior are not little versions of adult sex offenders. That this population typically does not engage in this behavior out of a deviant sexual interest. So deviant sexual interest, I'm talking about prepubescent children, interest in sexual behavior with prepubescent children, sexual violence, compulsiveness. This tends to not be seen with this population. They tend to exhibit poor social skills. They tend to be impulsive, tend to be opportunistic. They're driven from curiosity and experimentation. ATSA, which is an organization that if you're interested in finding more research and more references, I would really go find ATSA. I think it's atsa.com. It stands for the Association for Treatment of Sexual Abusers. They have released 2 different practice guidelines. One is for the assessment, treatment, and management of male adult sexual abusers. And the other is the one that I'm holding in my hand right now, which is the practice guidelines for assessment, treatment, and intervention with adolescents who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior. They felt that it was necessary to include 2 different practice guidelines because the treatment and assessment and really requirements, safety requirements, are dramatically different from each other. ATSA stated that adolescents who have engaged in sexually abusive behavior are fundamentally different from adults who have been sexually offended and require a different set of guidelines in respect to assessment, intervention, and public policy approaches. So I know that this is probably something that most of the people on the call know, but that anytime that we talk about adolescence, we have to talk about adolescent brain development, because this is really at the core of what we're talking about when we talk about that this is a different population. One of the most important points that we can share is dopamine. Okay, so dopamine is a chemical in the brain, it's a neurotransmitter, and dopamine is the chemical that tells us that something feels good. So whether that's a enjoyable activity, whether that's a stressful activity, whether that's a thrill-seeking activity, it's something that gives us a rush and it gives us a feeling of good when we do that behavior. Some people that are really into running say that they have a runner's high when they start running. Now, I've run a whole bunch of times. I've never experienced a runner's high, but that apparently theoretically people do this. But it's something that drives us to continue to do something because it makes us feel good. Well, adolescents have an interesting relationship with dopamine. So dopamine in the adolescent brain is actually at a lower level than it is with the adult counterpart. But what the difference is that when adolescents engage in a thrill-seeking, sensation-seeking behavior, their brain is flooded with dopamine at a much higher level than adults experience that sensation when they're doing the same behavior. So adolescents, the low level of dopamine means that adolescents on par typically at baseline are relatively bored. That adolescents talk about that I'm bored. Why can't I do something fun? And that is really biologically due to this low level of dopamine that is in their brains. But then when they have a pleasurable activity, when they have a sensation behavior, that it makes them extremely susceptible to that feeling. That probably the way to the best counterpart to this that we have, the best example of this is serial substance abusers or substance users, and people that use cocaine, that use methamphetamines, even use alcohol, even though alcohol is a depressant, that it will flood your brain with dopamine. And that says, this feels good, I want to do it again. But the problem with substances is that after that rush of dopamine is felt, it tends to go down and it tends to diminish, and it tends to diminish at a lower rate than what it was at before. And so that's the way that the normal juvenile adolescent brain is at its normal baseline. So risky behavior, sensation seeking, this is very susceptible to adolescents, that adolescents are going to seek out that sensation, those risk-taking behaviors, because they're trying to almost chase that dopamine high. You combine that chasing the dopamine high with increased levels of testosterone, and then you also kind of add on the fact that the frontal lobe of the adolescent brain is not fully developed, so you're not going to have adult levels of organization, of planning, of strategizing, and that is really what we're looking at when we see an adolescent. Also, very interestingly, is that the intellectual development happens before socio-emotional maturity. So you can be intellectually mature before you're social-emotionally mature. And what that means is that you're going to be able to intellectually understand that something's wrong. But when you're presented with the option of doing something fun, you're probably going to take that option of doing something fun. And I challenge everyone that works with adolescents to think back to the time that we were adolescents, that all of us did crazy stuff, that we knew at the time that this was a bad idea, but faced with our friends and faced with peer pressure and the idea that this was going to be a fun thing, we chose the fun thing. And then 10 years later, we look back and say, that was a really dumb idea. Well, it was a dumb idea, but it was our brain and our dopamine telling us to do that. This is also something that probably most prosecutors know about the age crime curve. This is a pretty stable phenomenon that we notice with most criminal behavior with the development of the brain. So that brain typically reach social emotional maturity around the age of 25. And this is what we see really across the board, is that we see criminal behavior, and in this graph, this is violent criminal behavior. Also, the dotted line is property crime. It almost follows it exactly. That we find that criminal behavior tends to steeply increase from about the age of 10 to the age of 19, 20. At 19 or 20 years old, 20, 21, 22 years old, and then it steeply decreases. And this is a trajectory that is followed in almost every culture across the globe, is that we see that criminal behavior sharply reflects brain maturation. And so this is why this is important. There's a phrase when you're working with juveniles, it says alive till 25. And it's this idea that if you keep someone alive, if you keep them out of jail, until they're 25 years old, they're going to do okay for the most part, statistically speaking. That people tend to not go to prison for the very first time at the age of 25. They tend to not get their very first criminal charge at the age of 25. And so if you do that and keep them alive till 25, you should be okay. So let's address some of these issues. So area number one is what are the best practices for risk assessment and prediction of future offending? So the ATSA guidelines, and this is the guidelines for assessment, treatment, and intervention with juveniles who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior, state, and this is something that probably people don't want to see, is there are no consistently reliable predictors of sexual recidivism risk, especially among youth. And that, as a prosecutor, I would imagine, is a very frustrating thing, is that we want to be able to see that this is the list of risk factors. This is the thing that if we can check these boxes off, we know that this person is at a high risk. And the problem is that the science really doesn't follow that. But I understand, and all therapists understand, that these are necessary, that we live in a world. I have two children myself. I've got a 6-year-old and I've got a 2-year-old. And I want the world to be a safe place for them. We want safe societies. We want people to be able to We want to reduce victims. And so these risk assessments have to be done. And so there's a few guidelines that I would propose are really necessarily components of effective assessments. Is that, as we've just talked about, normal adolescent behavior is extremely dynamic. It's really difficult to predict future behavior. So at the age of 13 or 14, a 13 and 14-year-old is very different than a 17 and 18-year-old. And especially if you think about 10 years from now, when you're looking at a 23-year-old, it's very hard to predict what that person, what that 13-year-old is going to look like when they're 20 years old. And so we need to be very careful about having any prediction of future behavior. Any kind of assessment, a good assessment is going to include at least two developmentally appropriate measures, that these should be standardized measures, that they should have a lot of evidence-based research to them. And we're going to talk about a couple. That assessments also need to include a very comprehensive clinical interview, and you have to do a comprehensive record review. Record review could include the police report, as many records as you can get for the individual. That is the best approach. I have seen this before, and this is something that you should never do, is base your future prediction of risk on a single measure. There are measures out there that will say that this is a low level, a medium level, or a high level of chance to reoffend. But the truth is that it should never be done. You should never have a single measure, that there should be multiple measures coupled with other information, coupled with a clinical interview. The question for the assessments really should not be, what risk are they? And I understand why people want to know what level of risk that this individual is to reoffending back in the community. But that is really fraught with a lot of problems. As we stated, that's very difficult to predict. So the best question that the assessment can answer is, rather than what risk level are they, what does this individual need? What are the services that they need? What are the treatment services that this individual is going to need to be able to safely return to society, to be a safe and productive member of society? An effective assessment will include both risk factors. So those are risk factors are things that will increase risk of future abusive behavior, and as well, and this is an important and protective factors. And so protective factors are those factors that we know protect against future abusive behavior. So I think those are two extremely important things. So I'm going to talk about two assessment tools. This is not a comprehensive list. There are a couple other assessment tools that I'll briefly mention in regards to these as well, in addition, but these are two very good assessment tools that I would be very happy to see on any kind of assessment for this population. Number one is the JSOAP. This is the Juvenile Sex Offender Assessment Protocol. It's in its second edition. This is a 28-item checklist of risk factors designed to assess risk of sexual violence and general delinquency in male adolescents with a history of sexually coercive behavior and/or adjudications for sexually abusive behavior. It's got 4 scales. It's got sexual drive, sexual preoccupation, impulsive antisocial behavior, clinical treatment, and community adjustment. It does not have cutoff scores. So you are not able to use the JSOAP and say that this individual did not have a particular score, so therefore that they're going to have a high risk of recidivism. The JSOAP manual also states that decisions about reoffense risks should not be based exclusively on the results from the JSOAP-2. JSOAP-2 should always be used as a part of a comprehensive risk assessment. The other assessment tool that I would really recommend is called The Professor. Professor is protective plus risk observations for eliminating sexual offense recidivism. So I know in the pre-presentation questions, I was looking that there were several questions about the eraser. And so eraser was developed by the same individual that developed the professor. The eraser was developed back in 2000, and the eraser was an eraser is estimate of risk of adolescent sex offense recidivism, and that was a very widely used assessment tool. Jim Whirling, who developed the eraser, said the eraser only had risk factors, and he felt that there was a problem with that, and so he developed a counterpart to that called the -13, and that the -13 really looked at the protective factors and said that you should use both of these assessments together. And then in 2019, he developed the Professor. So Professor is a fairly new assessment tool, but he combined the eraser and -13 into one assessment tool. So Jim Whirling, who developed the eraser, states very emphatically that you should not use it anymore, that you should be using the Professor. And Professor is a structured checklist to assist professionals to identify and summarize protective and risk factors for adolescents and emerging adults. So it's from age of 12 to 25 who've offended sexually. It's intended to assist with planning interventions that can help individuals to enhance their capacity for sexual and relationship health and thus eliminate sexual recidivism. It's, again, not designed for predicting risk of future offending. It has 20 different factors. So the way that it works is that on the right hand of the slide, it has 20 different factors that are considered to be bipolar factors. And so these are both protective and risk factors and risk characteristics of that were chosen based on a review of the literature and clinical experience with adolescents who have offended sexually. And so, for instance, that number one is hope regarding healthy sexual future. And what they found in the literature is that if an individual has a hope that they're going to, as most of the adolescents that I have worked with have, of one day getting married, one day having children, one day it's being a productive member of society, then that is considered to be a protective factor. That is something that is going to protect them from engaging in sexually abusive behavior. But if they cannot see a way out, if they can't see that sexual future, that healthy sexual future, then that is going to be a risk factor. And so that's the way that the Professor works. One thing that is extremely important too is that effective assessments of sexual harm do not solely focus on the juvenile's sexual behavior and sexual harm, but they include a global perspective of the juvenile. Is that this is an extremely, extremely important point. Is that assessments, when we're talking about it, if they only focus on this very narrow part of the juvenile's life and behavior, that we're going to miss a whole perspective of what this juvenile is and what they bring to the table and what their treatment needs are going to be. And so we need to have, in addition to a focus on sexual behavior, we're going to need to talk about all the different factors that are going into this youth development. What are their interests? How do they do in school? What is their family life like? What is their substance use like? So this is something that we're all going to have to really kind of focus on. Area number two is something that us therapists always like to talk about, is that treatment works, and we have empirical evidence to really show that. And so what works in reducing recidivism? And this is really, this doesn't just apply to juveniles who engage in sexual abuse behavior. This applies to all juveniles who have become engaged with the juvenile justice system. And this actually also applies to adults that end up in the criminal justice system. This is called the risk needs responsivity principle. This is something that guides our work in North Carolina and guides a lot of work throughout this country. It really, the principle is that you have to look at the risk, and the risk is those criminogenic risk factors. And you have to match the intensity of intervention with an individual to their risk of reoffending. Then the need principle is you have to target those criminogenic needs. And so what is the risk of them reoffending? What are their needs that they're showing? And then responsivity principle is you have to take that treatment and tailor it to the individual's learning style, motivation, culture, demographics, and abilities of that juvenile. You have to address any issues that may affect their responsivity, their ability to understand and participate effectively in that treatment. So when we talk about criminogenic needs, we know a lot about this. We have a lot of literature out there that talks about juveniles who engage in criminal behavior and what are the factors that mostly drive this behavior. And what are the factors that we really need to address in treatment? And we know that the top 4 risk factors are thinking and beliefs. So whether they have thinking and beliefs that tend to be pro-criminal, whether their personality and behavior, what is their peers, who do they associate with the most, what are their family circumstances? Do they have families that tend to support a pro-criminal type of behavior? The other risk factors are substance use, education, employment, and use of leisure time and recreation. We know that treatment, by far, and a lot of people ask this question, well what's the best predictor of future behavior? And we've already said that that's very difficult to predict. But if we want to point to one factor that's the best predictor of future behavior, it is whether that juvenile has engaged in treatment and effective treatment. And so what is effective treatment for juveniles who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior? We know that it's relationship-based. We know that it's supportive. It's supportive group. It's pro-social. It's skills-based. It's focused on teaching skills associated with psychosocial maturity, including delayed gratification, future planning, impulse control, perspective taking. It has to be trauma-informed and focused on the trauma that youth may have gone through. It should be strengths-based. That the treatment that was done 20 years ago, I would say, was not very strengths-based, and the training that I first started on was not very strength-based. And so we're learning about, focusing on those protective factors, enhancing that resiliency that individual will have to be able to not go out and return to recidivating behavior. It has to be individualized. That there are a lot of very good standardized treatment out there. There's a lot of manuals. There's a lot of manualized treatment. North Carolina juvenile justice system, we certainly use manuals. We use Phil Rich, stages of accomplishment. We use the Pathways workbook, and those are very good. But that can't be the only path of treatment. That has to be supplemental to what you do with the youth. It has to be that you have an individual approach to that juvenile, and then you can use these supplemental materials that we really find that works, because again, this is a very diverse group of people, and if you put 2 or 3 of them together, you might have to have 2 or 3 different types of treatment plans for them, and you really should. It has to focus on brain development, sensory, skill-based. It has to be family-focused, and that's something that's really extremely important. Is that what we find is the most effective treatment out there is when we can have that youth, that juvenile, stay with their families, stay in the community, and wrap services around them. We find that MST, with this multi-systemic therapy, it's probably the highest regarded standard of treatment that we have for this population. It's the most well-researched. And what that is that's home-based. That is when juveniles engage in this type of behavior. that we send services to the family and get the family as an integral part of this treatment. There is something dramatically lost when you have to take the juvenile out of the home. Sometimes that is necessary. Obviously, I've been around enough to know that for the safety of the family, the safety of the community, that sometimes you have to remove that juvenile from the home. And I certainly understand that. But the best treatment option out there is to get that kid back to the community and surround services around them. And then we also want to focus on healthy sexuality. We want to focus on relationships, is that we don't want to have this kid just simply be scared of sexuality, is that sexuality is a part of normal adulthood, is a healthy part of adulthood. And we want to teach them what healthy sexuality looks like. What is a healthy relationship? We don't want them to simply avoid. We want them to be able to actively engage in the best possible life out there. As Ms. Larson already stated, treatment is extremely effective. So Whirling and Kerwin back in 2000 did a 10-year follow-up of juveniles that had engaged in sexually abusive behavior, and then did a 10-year follow-up post-treatment, and found that only 5% of them recidivated after 10 years or within 10 years, compared to the comparison group who did not have any treatment, had 18% of them. 20-year follow-up, that 9% of the population accrued a sexual charge within 20 years, and 21% of them who did not engage in treatment ended up getting a sexual charge. The interesting thing about this survey, though, and treatment is really not the sexual charge part for me. It's really the non-sexual violent charge and any charge. Because what this says to me is that if you look at these numbers, any charge, 35% for people that had gone through treatment, and the comparison group was 54% had any type of charge except for sexual charges. And any type of charge after that. And actually, I'm sorry, that 32% had a non-sexual violent charge. That what this says to me is that it is much more likely, and this is an important point, I think, for everyone to really realize and ingest, is that it is much more likely for juveniles who engage in sexual abusive behavior, and that is their originating charge. It's much, much, much more likely for them to go out and do another type of charge, another type of criminal abusive behavior, and never return to sexual abusive behavior. It is much more likely for them to get caught doing something else that is non-sexual. And what that says to me is that we have to think about treatment as not just focused on sexual and sexual deviant sexual arousal and making sure that this individual is sexually healthy, that we have to focus on all of it. We have to really learn about appropriate ways of living. We have to learn about harm that happens from non-sexual violent charges as well. If you simply just focus on sexuality in treatment, you're going to miss the vast percentage who are going to go out and commit a non-sexual violent charge. And we have a lot of facts about this population that most studies show that juvenile sexual recidivism rates vary from about 3% to about 11%. That these are all kind of follow-up studies that really kind of focus on that. And the interesting thing about this is that we not only that these recidivism rates are low, but therapists are getting better, that we're understanding this treatment a lot better and we're getting better at it. So 106 studies involving 33,783 adolescents adjudicated of a sexual offense between the year of 1938 and 2014. That a mean follow-up with that group of about 5 years. What we found is that the studies that were conducted between 1980 and 1995 showed a recidivism rate of about 10.3%. And 33 studies between the year of 2000 and 2015 reported a sexual recidivism rate of 2.75%. And so what that says is that between 1980 and 2015, we've had a 73% reduction in recidivism rates. And we are getting better at this treatment. That back in the 1980s, we were still doing a lot of these type of punitive approaches to juveniles, and we've learned a lot. We've learned how to individualize this treatment, and we've gotten better. All right, so area number 3, that these are other important factors associated with a reduction in recidivism. The first one that I really have to say here is labeling. That you will notice that the title of my section was that juveniles who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior. That the term sex offender is something that we have all said, but that is something that we're really kind of challenging right now in the recent research. There's labeling theory research out there that finds that assigned labels for youth impacts on self-perception, isolation, acceptance from peers and community partners, participation in activities that facilitate social reintegration, and ultimately an increased risk of recidivism. So labels such as sex offender can lead a juvenile to identify as a delinquent self-identity. They can have decreased pro-social expectations, increased association with delinquent peers, increased risk of likelihood of engaging in subsequent delinquency. And so if we want to really kind of stress to this individual that we do not want them to be a sexual offender, that we really should stop calling them sexual offenders. So the preferred language is something like neutral, person-centered labels that focus on behavior rather than self-identification with the offense are really actually shown in the research to improve the rates of recidivism. So examples could be youth who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior, youth who have committed sexual harm, children who display problematic sexual behavior. It tends to be for children. Problematic sexual behavior is something that really has been used in like other populations, but it tends to be for like younger children. We need to focus on the harm that happened, the accountability, and not identity. And there is, this may sound subtle, but calling an individual a sexual offender means that individual's identity is that behavior. When we call an individual who has engaged in this type of behavior, it's very easy to separate the behavior from the person. And so when we can do that in treatment, we can say, this doesn't have to be you. This is a behavior that you have engaged with. This is harmful, and we're going to teach you how to do something better and how to live a better life, rather than simply just saying that this is who you are. That labeling that type of label is really akin to the old AA models, Alcoholics Anonymous, where you say that I'm an alcoholic. And that's really where a lot of this type of treatment came from, was this relapse prevention model. But really what we find is that it's much more productive and leads to less harm being conducted in the community if you are able to separate this label. Labels matter, and what we call people matters. Ms. Larson also commented on trauma, and I just want to say it really quickly. So the ACEs study that Ms. Larson said at the beginning was an extremely important study. We found that this was very, very important and continues to be important. That study, we continue to have findings about it, and continues to be a way to quantify this trauma. Trauma is an extremely important part of this whole conversation. The juveniles that come into the juvenile justice system, we know are more highly traumatized than individuals outside of the juvenile justice system. We know this. That what we also know is that juveniles who have engaged in sexually abusive behavior tend to have similar rates of exposure to trauma to other justice-involved youth, but significantly lower than convicted adult sexual offenders. And so we know that this is something that has been extremely important to look at. And another nice slide to kind of think about is that these are really the prevalence of ACEs in male youth that cause sexual harm. So this was actually put together by a colleague of mine, Jeff Sidoli, who's actually answering a lot of the chat right now. And what we find is that that these individuals, that a large percentage of them have experienced really childhood trauma. And if we don't address that, if we don't talk about the trauma, that trauma tends to be a barrier to be able to getting into deeper treatment. And so if you never talk about the trauma, you're going to miss that huge doorway to be able to get into a deeper part of that individual. It's also interesting to look at that sexual victimization here, is that a lot of people have a stereotype that juveniles who have committed sexual abusive behavior that must have actually gone through sexual trauma early in life. And that tends to not be really necessarily true. That we certainly have, it's about 35%, what we find in the literature. It's about 35% of juveniles who have engaged in sexual abusive behavior have been also the victim of childhood sexual abuse. And that is something that is almost disappointing to some people, because that is a way to have sympathy for this group of people, is, oh, well, they were victims themselves, and obviously they're reenacting this victimization. But we also find that is a similar rate to other juveniles who have engaged in the juvenile justice system. It's a very similar rate really across the board. So important things to remember about trauma is it's important to understand that trauma plays a significant role in the background of offensive behaviors. But that does not mean that it's an excuse for the offending behavior. It does not mean that that gives you a carte blanche to be able to commit harm towards other people. Trauma is a major treatment need, and if you don't address the trauma, you're really going to miss a huge window into this juvenile's life. And if you have untreated trauma, that is a risk of further recidivism. Don't expect that everyone needs the same type of trauma involvement. So that goes into the whole saying that juveniles, don't assume that a juvenile that comes in who has engaged in sexually abusive behavior has been sexually victimized themselves, about 35% of the time. Do adhere to principles of individualized treatment approaches. The last thing, or the second to last thing that I wanted to say, is that we really need to be focused on the harm. That this has really kind of been my soap opera, my sermon that I've been having in juvenile justice in North Carolina for the last couple of years, is focus on restorative justice. Is that I think restorative justice has a capacity to be able to change the world, change our entire understanding of the offender system. Effective therapeutic intervention should always include a component on personal accountability and enhanced empathetic understanding of victim impact. When appropriate, if desired by the victim, the restorative justice victim-offender dialogue process has the potential of creating a healing and restorative space for the victim and the youth. So in North Carolina, that we use these 5 steps of accountability as a way to guide that juvenile through our juvenile justice system. And it really focuses on the harm that happened through this behavior. that one of the things that we talk about is the fact that if you go and you steal someone's car, the state of North Carolina really isn't hurt by that. But I'm hurt because I can't get to work. And so there is harm that happens. And so we really have to focus on what is the harm and personalize that harm rather than trying to avoid getting caught again and getting another charge. The last thing that I'm going to say is just kind of a plug for something called the Good Lives model. The Good Lives model is a model of treatment that is really focused on the very kind of simple premise that we as therapists are not, our guiding principle is not that this youth simply avoids future sexual behavior and future sexual offending. Is that we as therapists are really hoping and to give them the tools to be able to have a good life. Is that these are simply human endeavors and that you want to have a full and complete life. And we know that if you have a full and complete life, then you're much less likely to go out and commit harm towards other people. So in summary, just want to say incredibly diverse group of people, not little versions of adults. Assessments should be done to not be done to predict future behavior. It really needs to be focused on what are the treatment needs of this individual. Treatment's very effective, and it really is the best predictor of future success and the lowest rate of recidivism. It's much more likely for juveniles who have committed and engaged in sexual abusive behavior to commit future non-sexual harm than sexual harm. Trauma is a necessary component to include in treatment, and a focus on treatment should be the reduction of harm and learning how to live a life full rather than an avoidance of reoffending. So I'm going to include my my address, my email address, and my phone number. So if you have any questions, I know that there's probably a lot of questions that were in the chat, or I know that there's a lot of questions that we're not going to be able to get to today. I would welcome your emails. Try not to call all the time, but you can call during normal work hours. How about that? And we'll try to kind of answer your questions, or I can find people that certainly know the answers to these questions. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. It's wonderful to have you do this presentation, including so much information. And as you said, we have a ton of questions, so let's get right to it.
Okay.
I know that you said that that it isn't the majority or even close to the majority of juveniles who have been sexually offended and therefore reenact that offending. But we have a question here. How can we best help youth who have been victimized normalize the behavior and have victimized other children to break that cycle? So let's assume that there's more than one way to be victimized, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, so that is a really excellent question, and that's something that I can give a long answer to. I will try to make it short, but it's basically so good treatment starts with good assessment. Is that we need to have a individualized assessment that really kind of identifies the treatment needs of this individual. That we know that juveniles work best in the community. So if there is an avenue to keep kids in the community, to keep them surrounded by people that they know, surrounded by their caregivers, surrounded by family, that is the best option. Obviously that's not always the practical side, that you have a public safety aspect that like you really have to think about. So obviously I think that's an important consideration for that, but that is what we see with the lowest recidivism rates. Tend to be kids that are kept in the community. There needs to be that if you, and with that being said, that if you take the kid out of the home, you still, that whether they're at a juvenile justice facility or in a residential treatment center, you have to include the family, because every juvenile in our system is going to be getting out and they're going to be going back to their community. And so you have to involve the caregivers as much as possible and really have to kind of stress that. That while you can't assume that there's trauma, and I think that that's a really important thing, you have to assess for it. And if there is trauma, you have to talk about it. That in North Carolina, and I think that this is really a national standard that we have. We use a system, a model called TFCBT, that's trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. That's something that is really kind of guides, and there's a lot of trauma resources out there, but it's really allowing that juvenile to get into the trauma, to really talk about this in a safe way, because we find that if you don't do that, if you don't allow the person to talk about the trauma is going to be there. And it's that picture of the iceberg, is that if you just kind of cut off the top, that is just going to keep on popping up. And so you have to really kind of talk about the trauma, and you have to focus on that. You can't simply just try to avoid sexual behavior. You have to really kind of teach them the skills. And so the best way to avoid future behavior is to get them involved in school, is get them involved in activities that they enjoy, get them in vocational resources. Don't isolate them, but really kind of get them to be robust members of society, whatever way that we can do that's in the best interest of public safety. Because obviously public safety is going to be the #1 predictor of all of this. But what we find is that if you give them the resources to be able to engage productively in society, that's going to be the best outcome for everybody.
You mentioned that sometimes that residential treatment isn't the best. Community treatment is the best, but sometimes residential treatment is necessary. Do you have any data points that you can give us to say when you see these three things together, then you have a concern for public safety and you think that residential treatment is preferable?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, obviously, I think the first one that I would see is that if the abuse happened within the home, then obviously that it may not be best to keep the youth within their home. So I think that for a time period at least, that you need to have that youth get out of the home environment, and we find that the majority of these of like this behavior happens within the home. So that is the end result. So if there is a safety risk of having this juvenile stay in the home, I think that's the most prevalent risk factor there. Also, that the degree of violence, degree of aggressiveness, that if they are compulsively aggressive, I think that's certainly something. Certainly the use of any kind of weapons, it's difficult to say here are the three factors that would really prevent this, but you have to measure the level of risk to the safety of the community and safety of the people within the home, compared to the risk of having this individual deeper into the juvenile justice system. And that is something that you have to really factor on a individual basis, and you really have to think about it for each juvenile that we're going to encounter. And that's a tough decision.
You mentioned multi-systemic therapy, MST wraparound services, as a very effective way of dealing with this because you're involving the parents. And I've seen this, the National Gang Center is recommending MST therapy for gang interdiction. It's being recommended for lots of things. Drug treatment, it's more effective drug treatment when you involve the parents, even when the juveniles are old, they're 17, 18. Can you talk about why that is in this context?
Well, I think that anytime that you get so MST is a very intensive process, that you have therapists that are very highly trained. It is expensive, so that is one of the things that people that is a really kind of prohibitive factor sometimes in really doing MST. Also, FFT, functional family therapy, is also another option, very similar to MST. But it is something that we find that anytime that you have the level of intensity that MST offers, where you have a therapist coming out to the home 3 times a week, and really a 24-hour call, where the families can have someone to call 24 hours a day, and have a trained therapist to be able to talk to, that is really the most effective answer. It's that David Prescott, who is one of the gurus in this field, talked about that if he was king of the world one day, he would make sure that there were a lot more probation officers out there, that you would have a lot more community supervision. Because that's one of the things that we run into all the time, is that when you go back to the community, the resources tend to not be there for this effective level of supervision that we really need to maintain for these juveniles.
Bringing that makes me think about aftercare for juveniles who are in residential treatment. What do you recommend for those returning to their communities?
Yeah, so again, I think that this is something that I don't mean to just be repetitive here, but it's very individualized. And so we have to, this is something that you have to think about, what are the needs of this individual. So something that an assessment tool such as the professor that looks at these 24 different elements and breaks our 20 different items, that breaks it down by protective versus risk factors, is that you have to look at those risk factors that are identified for this juvenile and focus your treatment around that. So I think supervision in the community is extremely important. You have to work with the families. If there is somewhere where you have to get the family together before the juvenile re-enters society, and you have to, it's very highly recommended that you at least have sessions with the family and talk about what's needed. You have to think about a safety plan. Safety is obviously going to be important. That we always have to think about technology when we're having juveniles re-enter our society, that you have instant access to pornography that is on your cell phones and on your laptop computers. And so you really kind of have to think about, what are the access points to technology. So you have to really individualize it. And I don't mean to say that is a cop-out answer, but it is something that has to be on an individual basis. That this one-size-fits-all community supervision plan really isn't effective with this group. You have to think about what this juvenile needs.
Great. Now I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we got in the chat.
All
and
right.
One of them was related to an AXA study that says very young children with problematic sexual behavior suggests that 45 to 80% of them have been sexually victimized. But your figures were lower, and I'm assuming that's because you were including all age juveniles. Can you talk about what age juveniles this figure, if this figure is correct, for younger younger victims rather?
Yeah, I would have to actually look at the study that they're talking about. I have not actually seen that study, so that might be news to me. That the study that I was referring to was that there was a study that was going on and looking at individuals that had committed sexual offenses later in adolescence, and so it could be that the number for when you look at adolescents is lower than it is with the younger children. That would certainly make sense. So yeah, I would have to look at that study and look at it. And I will. I can actually respond to it. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, great. So you can respond to that question. I know as a prosecutor, it's something that really concerned me, because when I saw very young juveniles behaving sexually towards even younger children, I was wondering, do I need to call Department of Social Services? Because where did this child learn this behavior? And how can I call Department of Social Services when I'm also, involved in an adjudication with this juvenile? So I think a lot of prosecutors have that question of how closely can we correlate? So it's good to know that with the older juveniles, it's not a very close correlation as to if you've been sexually offended against, then you're going to repeat offend. But it might be the case that if you're a younger juvenile, the correlation is closer. So I will.
I think the problem is, and I'm sorry, but I think the problem is that what we find in the juvenile justice system, at least, is that really sexual abuse in children is so prevalent. Is that a high percentage of our kids, whether they go on to commit sexual abuse, sexual abusive behavior, or non-sexual violent crimes, that it's a similar level of experiencing sexual abuse in childhood. And it's, 35% of our kids that come in is a large number. Yeah, it is dangerous to assume, I think, when a juvenile is has sexual abuse, to say, oh, well, they are going to then go on to commit sexual abuse themselves. And I think that that's something that we really have to kind of get rid of, because the vast majority of individuals that have been sexually abused never go on to be perpetrators. And so I think that's a really kind of key element, is that this is not an excuse for this behavior, and also the vast majority of these individuals never go on to harm another person like that.
Got it. And now I want to talk to you about a question that we've discussed, which is that you've gone over how important it is to get treatment, and I went over how that treatment can reduce harm to future victims in a really profound way. But we only have, I read in a study, 5% of sexual offender treatments are evidence-based. Can you talk about why it is that we don't have more evidence-based treatment for juvenile offenders, and how do we get there?
Sure, I can take a stab at it, at least. Is that the most evidence-based treatment that we have is MST. Outside of MST, there is not a whole lot of evidence-based treatments, treatment packages, I should say, in terms of the whole treatment. We do have evidence-based approaches to treatment, and so the things that I was talking about earlier, when I talked about that we should, focus on trauma, that we should include the family in the treatment process as much as we want, that we should try to individualize it. These are all based on evidence, and these are components of treatment that are really kind of out there, that are evidence-based. It is the danger in evidence-based approaches is that they are standardized. And so these are standardized approaches that apply to a large amount of people, and you have to really kind of go through the like different kind of methodology that is dictated by the evidence-based approach. And so that's the challenge, is because this is such a diverse population, and this is a population that doesn't necessarily fit within a package, and say, well, this is a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. That's the big challenge, I would say, in terms of evidence-based approaches. It's a very good idea to continue the research, and that we have a lot of really good people out there that are doing a lot of really good work in this field, that are working and looking at treatments that work out there. But we do have a ways to go. That if you looked at the work that we were doing 15 years ago, that my first introduction to this type of treatment was, we sat in a room with 7 other juveniles, and we had all the juveniles go around and talk about what their sexual fantasies are, and then we critiqued their sexual fantasies. That's something that we obviously wouldn't do nowadays, because we found that that's not really effective. So it's good to have research. It's good to continue the drive and say, what is actually working with this group of people? Because you saw that in that one slide, where in 1980 to that it was at 10%, and then 10 years later or 20 years later, that we're down to 2.75% recidivism rate. And that is really kind of evidence that we are following the evidence out there and the research out there, but we do have a ways to go with this.
So we have a question from the list of questions that came in, which is about polygraph exams and whether those are used in treatment. That's a good idea or not.
Yeah. So the ATSA guidelines, which are the ATSA guidelines for, I will simply read it, because I know that there are several states that are still doing polygraphs for kids. And it basically says that polygraphs and plethysmographs are physiological measures designed for use with adults. Their use was extended to adolescents and younger children without establishing the measures scientific validity and without full consideration of their potential for harm. And that it goes on to state basically that it is highly recommended that this is not used with adolescents. This is not a good practice. That the thing that we find with polygraphs with juveniles is that there's a lot of false positives. There's a lot of juveniles tend to spike the polygraphs regardless of whether they're lying or not. Is that juveniles' brains are just so dynamic that they tend to really kind of spike it, and so we get a lot of misinformation from polygraphs, and it's not admissible to court, and it's really a bad practice to have.
All right, here's this will be I think our last question, and it's from the chat. And I think a lot of people have this question in their mind because of the times we're living in. How has the exposure to pornography and ongoing pornographic use impacted adolescents in committing sexual harm?
Yeah, so that is a huge question that people have written volumes on this and have long talks. What I can say is that the jury's still out, honestly. That we know that with young children, it's absolutely, you should have zero exposure to pornography. Pornography, that particularly for young children, is going to be very detrimental. We know that there's an association. We know that juveniles who commit and engage in sexual abusive behavior tend to be heavily involved in the use of pornography. That we know that's a fact. We also know that juveniles who do not engage in sexually abusive behavior but come into the juvenile justice system are also heavily involved with pornography. It is a very pervasive element that has come into our culture. I was looking at a statistic that probably the #1 online site for porn is called Pornhub, and they talked about that in 1980. In 1990, that mobile devices were used about 1% for their content. I guess 1990, that was even before the internet. So this must have been 2000. 20 years later, that's 78% of people are using their phones, PS, PlayStations to be able to access pornography. So it's a really pervasive element. There are a lot of dangerous elements to pornography. Pornography should be monitored. It should be really kind of monitored for these juveniles that particularly have engaged in this type of behavior. But it's very difficult to have a correlation and say pornography is responsible for this type of behavior because it is so widely used across all juveniles, unfortunately. So we have to continue. The reduction in pornography is a good thing, and it's something that to continually monitor when these individuals are in the community.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time. This question and answer session could go on for an hour based on the number of questions that we received. But I very much appreciate your being here with us today. And William, take it away. So
it helps. Yeah, it helps if I'm not on mute too. The dreaded mute button here. But nonetheless, thank you very much to our moderator and presenter, Rachel Larson. Thank you very much to our moderator or our presenter Peter, and to our colleagues with NDAA for allowing us to host such a wonderful event. Great engagement and lots of feedback from the audience. To our audience, please, just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements before you all log off, and we let you go for the remainder of the afternoon. So just a quick Reminder, we did provide a link to the NDAA online survey in the chat. It is also located in the handout that you were able to download. If you could, please take a moment to complete that link in that survey there. I'm sure our colleagues at NDAA will be much appreciated if you all provide some much needed feedback for this, along with other great webinars that we plan to host for you all in the future. So please take a moment to complete that survey. Note that you will receive your certificate of attendance within 24 hours via email. So please look out in your email for your certificate. If you would like to get in contact with NTTAC, you may do so through the information on this slide. Please be sure to go to Facebook and check us out at OJJDP NTTAC, where you can learn about upcoming events and additional resources for web events. If you would like to get in contact with OJJDP's Help Desk, you may do so at the phone number and email displayed on this slide. You can also visit OJJDP's website at ojjdp.ojp.gov to learn more about OJJDP. Be sure to sign up for their Juve Just listserv to learn more about events and view upcoming events on their events page on their website as well. Do you have a training and technical assistance need? Well, if so, you can submit your TTA request through the OJJDP TTA 360 platform. You can access that platform through the URL displayed on this slide. Again, as a reminder, this and other webinars are located on our NTTAC YouTube page. You can contact the TTA Help Desk if you would like to receive any supporting materials for any of the webinars that we have displayed on that page. And finally, just a reminder that we do have a couple of other upcoming events from our colleagues over at the Innocent Justice Foundation that are set for May 5th and 12th. We would love for folks to please sign on for those web events. My colleague has dropped in the link again for folks, so please be sure to click on that link and take that survey. And finally, before we close out, just one last poll question to provide everyone. And basically, what we want to know is, how do you plan to apply your knowledge? So you all should see a poll question that will pop up on your screen shortly. And on that question, we just want to know, how do you plan to apply the information that you learned? So as you all file out of the virtual room, if you could just take a moment to fill out that poll question and let us know how you plan to apply the information from this web event. On behalf of ourselves at NTTAC and our colleagues at the National District Attorneys Association, thank you all very much for a wonderful web event. Have a great day. Goodbye.